This time, Eric Holder is dealing the hand. It's Thursday, July 25th, and this is Now. Just a few hours ago, a new chapter was written in the historic battle over voting rights. In a speech this morning to the Urban League, Attorney General Eric Holder announced that the Justice Department will be fighting back against last month's landmark Supreme Court ruling, one that struck down Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act and threw into jeopardy the right to vote for millions of Americans.
Although mandated by the Constitution, voting rights are not always guaranteed in practice without robust enforcement. And that's why, despite the court's decision, I believe we must regard this setback not as a defeat, but as an historic opportunity for Congress to restore and even to strengthen modern voting protections.
Specifically, Holder announced that the Department of Justice will push the courts to require Texas to obtain approval or preclearance before making any changes to current voting laws.
Today, I am announcing that the Justice Department will ask a federal court in Texas to subject the state of Texas to a preclearance regime similar to the one required by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act.
The move marks the administration's first major move to protect voting rights since the High Court's 5-4 ruling on June 26th. Why Texas? Because only 2 hours after the Supreme Court's decision was announced, officials from the Lone Star State said they would begin changing voter ID laws and move forward with controversial redistricting that civil rights groups have called discriminatory. Texas officials have not acted alone in their quest to enforce new provisions that could specifically disenfranchise poor, elderly, and minority voters. Mississippi, Alabama, and the Carolinas have all followed Texas's lead and sought to enforce stricter voting laws. In his announcement today, Attorney General Holder signaled this would be the first, but not the last, effort that the DOJ would take to ensure the voting rights of all Americans are protected. According to the New York Times, the move marks a dramatically significant moment in the next phase of the Voting Rights Act's development. If this approach works, it will help update the Voting Rights Act even without congressional action. Joining me today, managing editor of thegrio.com and an MSNBC contributor, Joy Reid, president of the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University, Michael Waldman. And joining us from Capitol Hill is the Democratic Congresswoman from Texas's 18th District, Sheila Jackson Lee. Congresswoman Lee, I would like to go to you first. This is happening and has been happening in your backyard. What do you make of Attorney General Holder's announcement this morning?
Well, thank you for having me. As you well know, I've been on the Judiciary Committee for a number of years since elected and participated in the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act in 2006. And frankly, have been in a voting rights case probably for the entirety of my political and elected life. Not willingly, of course, but because of the acts of the state that I'm in. And the tragedy of it is that this is the state of Lyndon Baines Johnson, who pushed for the passage of the Voting Rights Act, and Barbara Jordan, who added language minorities. And frankly, I think General Holder has delineated the responsibilities of the three branches of government: the courts, the legislature, and yes, the executive. And he has not abdicated his duty to protect the American people. On the day of the decision, Texas did not wait to digest the decision or to mitigate what had been determined to be violating Voting Rights Act, that is the Texas Voter ID law. They implemented it right away. And we had already determined that 174,000 Hispanics were not going to be able to vote. That's why it was not pre-cleared. Immediately, they threw out the case of the North Forest Independent School District. 7 African-American elected trustees immediately lost their case, a winning case of pre-clearance that the Justice Department had under review. And the court came in that day in the state of Texas and immediately dismissed it based on the Supreme Court's decision. So the general is right. There is a federal law that says that one of the functions is the courts or the voting right. There's a vital function, and one of the vital functions is to protect the rights of African American voters. But I would make the argument that the Voting Rights Act protects all voters in America. It gives every voter the right to vote without obstruction, without barriers, and being protected of a calm place to go and vote.
Michael Waldman, I want to turn to you, given all the work the Brennan Center has done on the subject of voting rights. How momentous is this choice by the Attorney General to go forward? I want to read a little bit of analysis from the New York Times from Richard Pildes, who's a New York University professor. He says, if this strategy works, it will become a way of partially updating the Voting Rights Act through the courts. The Justice Department is now trying to get the courts to step into the role that the Justice Department played before the Shelby County decision. The Voting Rights Act has always permitted this in some circumstances, but this strategy wasn't used much. What do you think of the strategy?
So I think it's very important. It's exactly the right thing for the Justice Department to do all it can to enforce the law, and the Attorney General, in effect, is just doing his job and deserves credit for doing it. Under the law, places that have discrimination can be, as they say, bailed in. The Justice Department can go to the courts and say, you can put them in a pre-clearance system.
A pre-clearance regime,
But what that means is these are places that have a record of discrimination, and just as before, they would have to go get it cleared in advance. And in Texas, a federal court has already found deliberate discrimination in the redistricting in Texas, and also all these many other people separately who would be hurt by the voter ID law potentially. So it's very important. But even this, while updating, in a sense, the Voting Rights Act, really is not enough. Congress still has to step forward and do this updating nationwide or in some new way. The court has thrown it to Congress, has said, I don't think they should have struck down Section 4, but they did. Now it's up to Congress to fix it. It won't be, we can't just rely on the Justice Department or the courts.
And Congresswoman Lee, I would turn to you on that question of whether Congress will act. Representative Sensenbrenner he's a Republican and has crossed party lines to some degree in terms of pushing for Congress to do something about Section 4 and to update the Voting Rights Act. Are you confident that Congress can and will do something on this?
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, let me just say that the comments are correct. We have a responsibility. I think what General Holder has done for us is that he has placed this in a red flag category. This is a crisis. This is an emergency. He has gone in under emergency conditions to protect a very precious right to vote, which was guaranteed by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, but overall guaranteed by one's citizenship in the United States. But the Congress has the responsibility, the overriding responsibility, to speak on behalf of the American people and to write legislation. I'm going to remain optimistic and enthusiastic about the idea that that is a place of common ground in the Congress, both the House and the Senate. It was legislators who crafted the Voting Rights Act in 1965. It was legislators who repeatedly over the years provided a formula to have it reauthorized, legitimately so, and it withstood the test of time. Many of us disagree with the decision of the Supreme Court, but as legislators, we are directed and committed to fixing it. And yes, I believe there is sufficient bipartisan commitment, concern, and dedication with leaders like Jim Clyburn, Sensenbrenner, leaders like Mr. Goodlatte, leaders like John Lewis and Leader Pelosi, Hoyer, Becerra, and many on the Republican side of the aisle that are willing to work with me and others on the Judiciary Committee. John Conyers, a ranking member, great leader on this issue. Yes, I think there is a sizable base of individuals who understand that voting rights does not adhere to any specific group, but if you're giving voting rights and protecting it to African Americans or Hispanics or language minorities, you are protecting all of America, and that's the message that I want to give. This is about an American's right to vote, and we in the Congress are going to go forward and work on it and fix it in a bipartisan manner.
Joy, what the Congresswoman is saying is certainly, I think, a shot in the arm for those of us who are hoping for action on the issue. The fact that there are some Republicans that are willing to say that this is an American problem, not a black problem, not a Democratic problem, is certainly hopeful. And yet, the Texas Attorney General Greg Abbott tweeted out as soon as Attorney General Holder made known his new strategy at the Department of Justice, "I'll fight Obama's effort to control our elections, and I'll fight against cheating at the ballot box." We know that there are a whole host of Republicans who are not in favor of voting rights for all.
Absolutely.
And this is coming at a time when I think it is an understatement to say that the GOP has a problem with minorities on a host of different issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And the political incentives for the Republican Party are all on the side of restricting voting rights, because all of the emergent groups of voters, whether it's Hispanic voters, young voters, women, minorities, African Americans, are all trending toward the other party. So the incentive in states that are run by Republicans, and not just in the South, states like Ohio, all of those purple states where Barack Obama won, all the political incentives to them say restrict voting rights. But I think what's really great here is that Attorney General Holder is doing exactly what we would hope the Attorney General would do in this situation. He's saying, okay, Section 4 has gone down, but Section 5 still holds.
And Section 2 still holds.
And Section 2 still holds. So we're going to opt people in. And all of the expansions and reauthorizations of the voting rights since it was passed in 1965 have expanded it. They added counties in New York. There are New York counties that were subject to pre-clearance. All of the reauthorizations have expanded it. It initially didn't include language minorities. And as Congresswoman Jackson Lee pointed out, Barbara Jordan led the move to add language minorities, which is why Texas is at issue here. So I think that the good news here for people who care about the right to vote is that we do have an
Which should be actually everybody in America.
And unfortunately, it isn't. Right. And the fact is that for people who do care about this right, we do have an Attorney General who is doing his job. And this is what we need, because I'm telling you, Ohio, Pennsylvania, there are a lot of states that should be opted in.
And Michael, we're talking about Texas here, but North Carolina is set to enact some of the most strict and discriminatory voter ID provisions. They are trying to roll back same-day voter registration. They are trying to cut early voting by a full week. I mean, it is still dramatic to me that anybody actually gets behind the principle of deterring people from going to the polls.
They're cutting back on high school students registering to vote in their civics classes. Now, there's a threat to the republic, right? And that's really going to bring us down, finally. There's an interesting fact, which is the politics of this cuts in multiple ways. Last time, there really was a backlash against the effort to cut back on the right to vote. You saw people going to vote because they were angry that someone was trying to take their right to vote away. And, one has to hope that people will stay angry. The North Carolina law is really appalling. It is a wish list of every bad voting idea the country could come up with, all in one bill tied together with a bow. And whereas Section 5 would have stopped it before, it can't now. So I think the politics of this, I hope, will play out in multiple ways. Everybody in America should be trying to appeal to the right to vote. If we believe in the Declaration of Independence, we believe in political and civic equality, the idea that we're founded on this idea that we're all created equal, hey, that's originalism. Yeah. And that should be for everybody.
Let me add to this, if I might.
Please do.
Let me add to that reasoning, if I might. It should be noted that states like Ohio and Wisconsin push back on the voting rights, the voter ID, and themselves acknowledge the fact that might inhibit or prohibit Americans from voting. In Pennsylvania, that is not covered, at least large portions of it. There is a lawsuit going on right now around a 95-year-old woman that was denied or would have been denied the right to vote because of the Pennsylvania voter ID. The more we can show the expanse of what a voter ID or other obstruction to voting does to all of America, the more right General Holder is in using Section 3 and Section 2 as other tools of protecting the right to vote. The Congressional Black Caucus is leading on this issue in the United States Congress, but we have, with Chairman Marcia Fudge, but we have no doubt, working with our working group, that we're not going to be able to reach representatives in states beyond the states that are presently covered. And to emphasize something that most people don't tout, there is a bailout, even though General Holder is bringing forward a bail-in. Over 200 jurisdictions have bailed out. And so it's not a punitive initiative. It is to protect the right to vote. General Holder is on solid ground. I think he has indicated he's in an emergency. He's got a crisis. And when there is a crisis, when there is a disaster, then the Congress steps in to provide, I hope, guided, thoughtful legislation that will fix the problem and put back in place the enforcement provisions of the Voting Rights Act, which will also provide pre-clearance. That is a very vital tool that you're able to step in the gap before something disastrous happens to keep Americans from voting.
Joy, the question of Congress is an interesting one, and certainly we'll be monitoring it. I think it's important to note that yesterday in Iowa, Rand Paul said nobody in Congress has a stronger belief in minority rights than me. This is the man, if you will remember, who told our colleague Rachel Maddow in 2010 that he was against sections of the Civil Rights Act requiring businesses to accommodate all comers. If the GOP is to move forward in any meaningful way into this century, because I am convinced they're stuck in the last century with a lot of these policies, people like Rand Paul really need to start putting the money where their mouth is.
Yeah, I mean, and Rand Paul is the guy who I think wants to run for president, so he's going about to black colleges and saying, hey, you know, some Republicans were in the NAACP. So this is his MO, so I'm not surprised that he's doing that. But good for him. You know, if you can get some Tea Party Republicans to get behind the idea of coming up with a formula that John Roberts will find acceptable or that Scalia will find acceptable, bully for them, because that's what Congress is supposed to be there to do. But I am very cynical about the House of Representatives. We have a Speaker of the House who says they will be judged on how much legislation they repeal rather than how much they pass. So I think that the cure for these problems is an election. There is an election that can disinfect this entire process that's coming up in 2014.
As long as people can get to the polls.
Can vote. Yes. Right. And as we saw in 2012, the disincentives to vote and the attempt to stop people from voting actually motivates people. And I think that young people, women, African Americans, Latinos, everyone who is being targeted by the same Republican ideology of keeping you in a box and keeping you from voting against them needs to understand that the midterm election of 2014 is your chance to cure this problem. And if people don't avail themselves of it, you'll get 2010 all over again.
And midterm elections are traditionally low turnout.
Yep.
And they are very susceptible to the damage wrought by gerrymandering.
Right.
You know, as we all know, the number of competitive districts is vanishingly small these days.
Yes.
And that's true for a lot of different reasons, but it makes it more important for people to go to the polls, and it makes it harder to, you know, there are plenty of members of Congress who don't really have to worry about appealing to the middle.
84% of the House Republican caucus doesn't really need to worry about appealing to the middle, but all the more reason to get everybody turned out in these elections. Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, thank you.
I'm going to hold Congress to a strict scrutiny and insist that we do our job, but more importantly, I hope that the eyes of America will be on Congress, and that will motivate people to go out to vote when they see that we can or cannot do this job. We must be the standard bearer for every American having a right to vote. And
Congresswoman, we will try and keep those eyes focused and trained where it counts. Thank you for your time, and thank you to the Brennan Center's Michael Waldman, as always. After the break, President Obama takes his economic message back on the road, but Republicans keep trying to slash his tires. We will discuss the agenda and the GOP's temper tantrums when Sam Stein, Governor Ed Rendell, and Jonathan Alter join us next on Now.
A tornado flew around my room before you came. Excuse the mess it made. It usually does.
As a quarterback, I know how it feels to be blindsided. But with the available safety systems in this Buick Verano, like side blind zone alert, now that's pass protection. And rear cross traffic alert. Hello. I feel like the whole team's protecting me in here. If you don't know the innovative Verano, then you don't know Buick.
Lease this 2013 Buick Verano with 2 years of scheduled maintenance for around $199 per month. Consider it a new lease on luxury.